And I see several people from Ghana. Welcome, welcome. We have Sikri in the room and we have Enril. I guess we'll be waiting for a little bit longer to have a few more people assemble. So I'm going to tentatively say that we'll proceed at 14:05. Omar, how did you get the invitation? Was it passed on to you by Dwight, or did you just get my forward, or how it go?
Hello?
Yeah, Omar, I hear you now.
Yeah, it was passed on by Dwight.
I thought so. Okay, good, good. I see Steve just joined us as well.
Afternoon, everyone.
Hi, Herschel, how are you?
Yeah, I'm good, thanks. You?
Still with us, still above ground, so it's a good day. Everything seems to be fine out here.
That's great, that's great. All right.
We're just waiting for a few more people to come on, Herschel. I think we have a good presence from Jamaica at this time, or at least the ministry in Jamaica. I also see several stakeholders from Ghana. I think it might be the first one from Belize. Still awaiting Trinidad. And I hear that St. Lucia may no longer be with us, unfortunately, but we'll see how it goes.
Good afternoon, everyone. Jasmine Lawrence here from Trinidad and Tobago, Ministry of Public Utilities.
Hello, Miss Lawrence. You were having a microphone trouble the last time, don't it?
Yes, yes.
Glad
But
it's fixed.
I signed it on my phone this time.
Oh, okay. Good, good.
Everyone, Derek Phillips from the Regulated Industries Commission in Trinidad and Tobago.
How are you doing, sir?
Great.
How are you doing, Mr. Phillips?
And Jerry, just so you know, I'm going to sign off and join again by video and by phone. So you'll see me disappear, but don't panic.
I'll try not to wet myself. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. Courtney Powell, TIA and Tech. I haven't been with y'all for some time. Unfortunately, I've been very busy trying to aid the commission in this time. But however, I'm glad to be here today, and I'll try to stay in tune as much as possible.
Glad you're with us, Courtney. We got another person from Belize. How are you doing, Ryan? Mr. Cobb?
Hi, good afternoon. Fine, thank you.
Hello, is that I hear my friend Gail. How you doing, Gail? And I also see Miss Benice Joseph, who I think is from St. Lucia. If Thank you for joining us, Ms. Joseph. Didn't have St. Lucia too strong last time, but we're glad you're here today.
Hi, Jared. Good afternoon,
everyone.
Also see Kurt Inglis from St. Lucia as well. Glad you could make it.
He is there.
All right, so it's 2:05, and while we don't have everybody, we do have representatives from every country in one way or the other. We have Jamaica, we have St. Lucia, we have Guyana. I see some people from Trinidad and Tobago, and Belize is here as well. So if we don't mind, and with the idea that more people will be trickling in, I think maybe we could begin. I trust that everybody received the agenda as well as a invitation to a breakout session that's going to be running parallel to this plenary session. If not, you let me know. I will be posting relevant links to the meeting chat within this window here, so we can all be on the same page. Welcome everybody. I'm Gerald Lindo from the Caribbean Center for Renewable Energy and Energy Efficiency. And I want to just kick us off with a little bit of context. We have begun since early this year to implement a program of integrated resource and resilience plans throughout the Caribbean. We have 5 countries on our agenda. We have begun with 3. We've already begun with Belize, Guyana, and Trinidad and Tobago. And we've gone to various lengths or various stages within that process with those 3. We have 2 other countries, St. Lucia and Jamaica, who we expect to commence work with towards the end of this year or the beginning of next year. While we are in different places, we do think it's good to have a session like this to get everybody on the same page. And credit to Trinidad and Tobago, this session came out of an intervention that we had with them. While we were engaging on the topic of building scenarios and KPIs for we're working on the process of building up the scenarios and KPIs for the IRRP process. Trinidad made the point.
Okay, wait. So I'm not sure what your question is about.
I'm going to silence your Gail. Yeah, all right, I'll mute Gail there. My good friend Gail actually brought up the point along with her boss, the DPS Can, that they didn't want an IRRP process where people aren't brought along with the process. We didn't want a process where we'd be talking at a very technical level with a very narrow set of technical people, while the broader set of professionals would be involved, people in the environmental space, in the policy space, and so on and so forth. We didn't want them to not be included as well. And so they asked that we kind of take a step back and have a session that focus on some of the higher level questions around building an IRRP, questions having to do with what the country really expects to get out of an IRRP and how the policy imperatives that the country may be looking at can get reflected in an IRRP. So while it won't be at that super low technical level, at a higher level than that, it should be something that everybody can benefit from. Also, we recognize that, again, different countries are in different places. I think Guyana is probably furthest ahead in terms of selecting what KPIs and scenarios that they want to consider for their IRRP work. And all credit to them, that's great. I hope that their participation today can enrich it for everybody else. But I think other countries may not be in the same place. So again, having this meeting, which came out of TNT's request, can make sure that no country and no stakeholders within the country are left behind. So we're grateful for you to attend this session today, where we'll be going over some of the more, like I said, high-level aspects of the IRRP. Leading the session today in partnership with us is the team from the National Renewable Energy Laboratories out of the United States. We're very glad for their participation. We've had many fruitful interactions with them, and we know, hearing from some of you stakeholders as well, that working with NREL, you like it because you think they're quite professional and they have a lot to offer. So they will be walking us through most of the proceedings today. And at this time, I will turn over to our team from NREL. I guess we'll start with Eliza, and we can go from there. Or is it James?
Great, thanks, Jerry. Yeah, we will we'll take over, and thank you so much for joining us today. We're really excited about today's discussion, and as Jerry mentioned, today's workshop is hosted by the Caribbean Center for Renewable Energy and Energy Efficiency and supported by NREL. And James, would you mind showing the slideshow view of the slides? James is going to present the slides for us today via Teams. And what we've laid out for you today is a presentation that provides some context and background into IRRP planning. And then we really do want to make this an interactive session. So we have a few hands-on sessions included in this workshop that we'll go into in a few minutes. Next slide, please. We wanted to start by thanking Dr. Gary Jackson for reaching out to NREL to provide this workshop today. We always welcome a partnership with SICRI and enjoy the work that's being done in the Caribbean. I'm Eliza Hotchkiss, and I'm a senior resilience analyst within the Energy Security and Resilience Center at NREL. And I've supported a number of international projects and have on-the-ground disaster recovery experience and have worked in locations like the US Virgin Islands, Puerto Rico, Jamaica, Antigua and Barbuda, just to name a few beautiful Caribbean locations. And today I'm joined by my colleague, James Ellsworth, who is a research engineer in NREL's Integrated Applications Center. And James has supported projects in Puerto Rico. He's studied storm hardening for solar PV. He's worked in Guyana, and we've both provided technical content for the Resilience Energy Platform, which is included as a resource at the end of this presentation. And I'd also like to acknowledge the US Department of State for their funding to support the development of today's workshop. So it's a great partnership, and we're really excited to be here with you. Next slide, please. So as Jerry mentioned, we do have a number of different member states involved in this exercise. We just want to acknowledge that we have representatives from Belize, Jamaica, Guyana, St. Lucia, and Trinidad and Tobago. So we have a diverse set of stakeholders representing a lot of different entities, as you can see. I think many of you were introduced on our last session talking about your roles and the organizations that you represent. So I just wanted to take a moment to recognize that there are many different people on this workshop, and there are a lot of different backgrounds and missions, but we're trying to work together to reach a common set of goals. Next slide, please. A few housekeeping tips before we get started. If you're not speaking, we do ask that you mute your lines, and I apologize for some background noise here in my working environment. So I'll try to mute as soon as I'm done speaking. When we have questions from the audience, we're expecting that those will go into the Teams chat box, and we'll try to answer those when we have a couple breaks for questions. We do have a number of polls and interactive events, so we're asking that you please participate when prompted to do so. James will give you some more guidance on how to do that. And we will share the slides after the workshop, so don't feel like you have to take copious notes and write everything down. We just want to welcome your participation in this process today. So as I mentioned, we have a presentation that we're going to go through just to lay out the goals of today's workshop. We want to start with some country power sector overviews and baselines just to set some context. We'll talk about the goals of an IRRP. James will cover a case study where an IRRP has been applied and implemented. And then we'll break out into a group activity, which will be a polling exercise, and then breakout rooms. And you all should have received invitations from Gerald Lindo with the worksheets for the breakout room sessions, along with a link to those breakout rooms. So we'll talk more about that when we get to that part of the workshop. And then we'll end just by summarizing the process and talking about some potential next steps. Next slide. Oh, thanks, James. So the goal of today's workshop is really just to provide an overview of the IRRP process. For those of you who attended the last session, Dr. Jackson did provide a great overview of the process, but we're going to go into a little more detail today. The focus is on incorporating resilience into long-term power sector planning. So some of you might be familiar with the IRP process, but we're really emphasizing the second R in the IRRP process today. Another goal is to assist with developing scenarios and key performance indicators and how to weight those. And then I think, as you've heard before, the focus is really on building capacity. It sounds like you've had a lot of consultants coming into different member states and providing reports, but this is really to build some knowledge in this space so that you can all work together to develop your own scenarios for your own country. So before we discuss the IRRPs and the process, we wanted to take a few minutes to set the background to what we call future energy system conditions. So as I mentioned, we have 5 member states with different participants involved in today's workshop. And the price of electricity ranges from 3 cents a kilowatt hour to 34 cents a kilowatt hour across those 5 member states. Generation mixes range from a dependence on fossil fuels to integrating more of the renewable energy assets like solar or hydro. And we're going to talk about those in more specifics in a minute. But then another thing that we look at with the IRRP process is transmission and distribution losses and electricity access, because these really help to shape future conditions and help to set goals. And I'm sure this is familiar to many of you. But what's interesting is that transmission and distribution losses across the 5 member states are on average around 16%, and electricity access is about 95%. And with transmission and distribution losses, we really like to see those around as low as you can get, but a lot of the averages that we see are around 8%. So we'd like to get that number a little bit lower in the work that we do. Next slide, please. Just as 2 examples, we've compared Belize with Trinidad and Tobago. So on this first slide, you see some energy statistics related to Belize. These are all available through the U.S. Department of Energy's Energy Transition Initiative's Island Snapshots. These are available online. They've just been updated recently. And if you see a number that doesn't look accurate, please let us know, because we're really interested in making sure that this is accurate information. But it's interesting to compare Belize to Trinidad and Tobago, because Belize has electricity generation currently comprised of hydropower, some biomass, some fuel oils, solar, and then imports from Mexico. And if you compare that mix to the goals of 85% renewable energy generation that's been established within the next 10 years, you can see that 70 megawatts of hydro is a goal that's been set to be achieved by 2033, 5 megawatts of electricity from municipal solid waste, 30% increase in energy efficiency by 2033, and then a 20% reduction in conventional transportation fuel use by 2030. So a lot of these different goals have been set, and when you compare them to the current electricity generation mix, that will be helpful in looking at the IRRP process and setting goals there. And on the next slide, we've just taken the same information for Trinidad and Tobago, and as we learned on the last session that we had from Trinidad and Tobago, reliability rates are incredibly high. Electricity generation mix is predominantly natural gas, as you can see, and there's a 10% renewable electricity goal by 2021. So a very different situation from Belize, as we showed in the previous slide, but looking at the current conditions is going to be helpful in terms of setting future goals. The IRRP framework incorporates resilience and risk assessments to build the capacity of the energy system to survive, adapt, and to drive transformation in the face of shocks and stressors. And it sounds like a lot of you are having vulnerability assessments done to look at some of those threats and hazards and how they comprise the risks to your energy systems. We'll talk a little bit about that today. So it's important to have a lot of these different elements incorporated into the IRRP process. So as we've started, the baseline conditions help to inform the development of goals. They help to understand where you are today, and then you compare that to where you want to be in the future. So resilience and risks are two considerations that help to inform the targets within the IRRP process. Next slide, please. Thank you, James. So two things that we'll touch on just briefly. There's a lot of content that we could go into today related to establishing an IRRP. This might be an in-depth topic for a future workshop, but we did just want to mention that because renewable energy resources vary by location, it's important to know what your resources are before you establish goals. At NREL, we create and use solar maps and wind resource maps like the ones shown on the slide to determine where there's a good resource and which technologies are most appropriate for a specific location. So some countries might have a better solar resource than a hydro resource or vice versa. It's really important to understand what your renewable energy potential is before establishing a goal because you want those goals to be achievable. And on the next slide, another consideration within the IRRP process is understanding what your power sector risks are. Understanding risks is important because it will help you to understand where risks can be mitigated within the IRRP process. So again, this could be its own separate workshop, but I just wanted to touch really briefly on the fact that we talk about risks to the power sector in terms of threats, hazards, and vulnerabilities. And threats can include anything from economic downturn and the socioeconomic impacts on a country, or threats of cyber attack into a grid system. Natural hazards, as I'm sure you're all aware, are known to occur in the Caribbean, and they can include things like earthquakes, flooding, storm surge, hurricanes, landslides, and currently, or very recently, Sahara dust. And then vulnerabilities can be things like aging infrastructure or staff turnover, where staff are not trained on how to operate systems. And vulnerabilities can be the things that expose threats can expose vulnerabilities. So it's really important to consider all of these facets when we're talking about the IRRP process. So just some key takeaways from the background and setting the context is that between the 5 member states participating today, there are similar goals and opportunities, but then there are some unique challenges. So Belize and Trinidad and Tobago might have very different goals. They might have very different processes, but they might also have some common interests and goals through this process. We'll be revisiting the baseline and renewable energy resource and risk topics as we go through the goal setting and scenario development discussion, but just wanted to introduce those as concepts before we begin. And then James, I think on the next slide, would you mind guiding everyone through this polling exercise and the process?
Sure. So just for some background on the process, we'll ask a couple questions here. You can respond in a couple different ways. You can either go to the link that's on the slide, that pollev.com link. I also posted that in the chat for this Teams meeting. So if you go to the chat window, you can click on the link. And first question is, how familiar are you with the IRRP process? So if you go to that, you can also text in on your phone. If you text, follow the text instructions on the slide, which I'm not sharing right now, but I'll get back up in a second here so I can share the results. So probably the easiest way is clicking on the link right now. But, oh, here we go. Okay, so the instructions to join are in the chat and also on the top of this screen right here. Looks like we have 3 responses so far, so maybe we'll wait for some more people to get. Oh, we have some more responses coming in. Seems like most people are somewhat familiar with the IRP process. This is with 1 R. More people are somewhat familiar as this goes on. Give another 10 seconds for answers to come in here. All right, should we go to the next question?
Sounds good. Thanks, James.
All right. That one last-minute vote came in there. So next question, slightly different than the first question. How familiar are you with the IRRP process? So we threw a second R in there for resilience. And as expected, people are more familiar with traditional IRP than IRRP. That's showing in the results here. All right, so still one person extremely familiar maybe, but most people somewhat familiar. Some people never have heard of it, and then maybe one other person unfamiliar with it. So that'll help in us framing this workshop here. And also I think what we prepared will align very well with your background here to help provide you with more familiarity and expertise in this area. So one last poll question for now then will be, how much does your country currently consider resilience when making power sector decisions? I know resilience is, on your minds a lot in the Caribbean, being so severe weather prone, but this is specifically how much does it factor into your power sector decisions? We're getting a good mix between sometimes it is a factor, always and rarely. All right, so thank you for all your responses. Stop the polling now and head back over to the slides.
Thanks, James. So we just wanted to do that poll to get a sense of how familiar people are with the typical and conventional IRP process and the IRRP process and where resilience fits into energy considerations in general. So that was really helpful to help set the stage for us and give us some more background. All right, next slide, please, James. Thank you. So now we're going to talk specifically about IRRPs and the process that most countries follow when they're going through this planning process. And as we've been talking about, IRRPs stand for the Integrated Resource and Resilience Planning Process. And it's a strategic energy planning approach that enables power providers to identify a least regrets power resource investment portfolio, or one that is most resilient to potential future risks. And what I really like about this sentence is that it's focusing on least regrets. And this is something that Dr. Jackson mentioned during our last session as well. So it's focusing on least regrets instead of simply the least cost plan. So it's a very nuanced but very important difference between the IRP planning process. Next slide, please. The IRRP is rooted in the traditional integrated resource planning process that many of you are familiar with. But in IRRP, power providers identify a least cost power resource investment portfolio based on supply, demand, and transmission performance, as well as costs. IRRPs use that IRP process to create several least cost portfolios based on power provider interests, such as increasing renewable energy penetration or investing in a specific type of fuel. But scenarios are developed to represent potential futures. So those could include futures where there's other types of risk or increase in certain types of risks from those natural, technological, or human-caused hazards and threats that we talked about before, as well as the vulnerabilities. And based on the power provider's performance objectives, which could be environmental impact, it could be cost, energy independence, metrics are identified to test the portfolio's performance across those scenarios. So the power planner is going to use those results of the performance assessment to select the least regrets portfolio, meaning the portfolio that best satisfies power planning objectives across the array of potential futures. So the figure that's shown on the slide here just summarizes this process. And I will say that this is a pretty new process. Incorporating resilience into the IRRP process has been a fairly recent activity, and there are only a handful of countries that have gone through this previously. And you'll hear about one of those in a little while, but just wanted to emphasize that this is a newer process. Next slide, please. Thank you. So the extra R for resilience is included so that planners can start to address hazards, threats, and vulnerabilities. And those risks can be things that compromise the safety, reliability, and affordability of power delivery. So we've been seeing that there's more of a need for resilience to be incorporated into this planning process. But risks can also affect power generation, transmission, distribution, and the ability to meet demand, as I'm sure many of you are aware. So it's becoming more and more important to include resilience in this process. There's greater consumer benefit and sustainability. You can address fuel price risks through IRRP through diversification of fuels. You can address climate risks, demand side risks, and then IRRPs can manage demand growth, improve load factor, and increase revenue and improve customer satisfaction. So all of these are benefits to incorporating resilience into the traditional IRRP process. All resources are considered on a level playing field in the IRRP process, and that includes the entire energy system from generation, transmission, and distribution to demand side management. It covers a long planning horizon from anywhere from 10 to 30 years, and there's explicit treatment of uncertainty and risks, as we've been discussing, including climate risks, and considers policy, social, and environmental factors, including broad stakeholder engagement. And one thing you'll hear us mention a number of times today is that this is an iterative process that needs to be reviewed periodically. You're never going to be 100% resilient 100% of the time to every risk that is out there. And so it's really important to constantly revisit the IRRP and see how conditions have changed and if goals need to be changed or anything within that planning process needs to be altered. Some of the drivers for scenarios might include goals that require policy, new regulations and legislation at the country level, environmental protection measures, sustainable development, resilience, cost, and flexibility. And goals can be developed to be actionable and included in an IRRP, such as the desire to have more affordable electricity, to reduce energy burden across the country, reduce environmental impacts and meet NDC goals, and enhance resilience and increase reliability. So these are shown here to help frame and drive those scenarios and are just shown as examples of what might be considered. Next slide, thank you. I'm sure you're all aware that goals need to be supported by key performance indicators. So if a goal is to have more affordable energy to reduce energy burden, the cost and the revenue KPIs are going to be more applicable. These will include projects that address demand side management and return on investment, cost per kilowatt hour delivered, etc. So that goal will probably be supported by efficiency as well. And you might be interested in lowering the energy intensity of power systems and to increase the efficiency in buildings and systems. So residential buildings, commercial buildings, or industrial processes could be included in that. So it's really important to make sure the goal is linked to a KPI. And then on the next slide, we've just carried this concept through a little bit further, that the KPIs will include a specific metric that can support the goals that are established. And it's important that these be measurable and tied to the goal to support the project that implements the goal. So James will give an example of where goals and KPIs were set as part of an IRRP process in the next couple slides using the case study that I mentioned previously.
Great. So thank you, Eliza. And these slides that I'm going through will kind of help you all see what this process looks like in action. So the first example here is the country of Tanzania that actually went through an IRRP process. It's one of those handful of countries that has done so and called it an IRRP at least. There's great information and more in-depth detail on this case study if you'd like on the link that's on the bottom of this page. That's the fact sheet that's on the Resilient Energy Platform website. But looking at Tanzania, they have some of the challenges they had are a low electrification rate, though with goals of increasing that for sure. They have a heavy reliance on hydropower in their system. I think it's something like 50% of their generation comes from hydropower. And so while that's, an advantage from a carbon footprint standpoint, it does leave them susceptible to drought scenarios and under-generating power in those situations. They have poor financial performance. They are not bringing in as much money as they're spending. And then there's also a lack of supporting policy, legal, and regulatory frameworks. And so they're hoping that they could use this plan to to form policies that would support their long-term vision of their power sector. And who they are in this case is a wide range of stakeholders, like we have represented here on this call. And it's critical that you have representatives from all those agencies involved in the process so that when you do form this plan, it aligns with the goals of all those agencies and that also policies can be formed based on that. So as you see in the top right, it's a chart of their hydropower generation and their reference scenario with some historical data and out to the future, and then also a drought scenario. They really focused on this drought and the impacts that drought might have on their hydropower generation in this process. And here is just showing that with less water around to drive those turbines, you'll have a lot less generation from hydropower and struggle to meet the actual energy demand. That did actually happen as they were going through this process in Tanzania. And what they had to do was bring in and fire up a bunch of fossil fuel generators, which was costly and not as clean as their baseline system. So the steps they actually followed in this process, they split up their scenario development into two phases. It could be called one phase, but here they split it up into what they call portfolio development and then a scenario analysis. So they had 3 portfolios, a reference portfolio, a limited financing portfolio, and a renewable portfolio. Now for each of those portfolios, they developed several scenarios that would represent different potential futures that could happen in their country. And they've started with many more than 7, but whittled it down to the 7 they found were most important. And one of those they focused on was this drought scenario that I talked about. So to analyze the impacts of drought, they did use the WEEP tool, the Water Evaluation and Planning tool. And from that tool found that a drought scenario could reduce their stream flow by 30%, as much as 30%. And the result of that would be a 12% reduction in hydropower. And so in their planning process, they had to account for that 12% reduction that might happen in this drought scenario. And so then to evaluate each of these different scenarios and portfolios, they came up with different KPIs. Some of the KPIs they came up with are cost, environmental impact, fuel security and reliability, resource adequacy, and financial risk exposure. And so for each of those investment portfolios, they ran through each of the scenarios and then evaluated them based on how they performed for those different KPIs. And so they came up with a scoring matrix that they did run. They weighted the KPIs, how important are those for this country? And then once they ran their models and evaluated the scenarios, they evaluated how well those scenarios performed for each of these KPIs. They came up with a kind of a risk matrix which gave an overall score to their portfolios overall. Now for this IRRP, they selected this reference portfolio as their least regrets portfolio. It had advantages of least financial risk exposure and a balanced generation mix. They said it reduces greenhouse gases because part of their reference portfolio was actually expanding their hydropower generation and reducing their fossil fuel consumption. But then it was more expensive than their limited financing scenario, and it did leave them really sensitive to drought, as I mentioned before. Their renewables portfolio came in second in their analysis because it did diversify their generation more and covered that risk of potential future drought. So given that they went with a reference portfolio here, and it did leave them exposed to some future risk, especially for drought, they came up with some adaptation measures to filter into this. And some of those are listed here, things like improved water resource management. An example of that would be making sure that their irrigation was located downstream of their hydro generation plants, so there'd be more water available to drive those. More efficient electricity transmission and distribution to address those high losses on their system. End user energy conservation, end user energy efficiency and conservation through kind of outreach and education programs. And then increasing their generation capacity, especially in terms of addressing peak load and also factoring in some distributed generation. Okay, so at this point, that's been a lot of background information to cover. I know, hopefully you're all following along, but we'll pause here before continuing to see if there are any questions. And remember, if you do have questions, I can check now to see if there's any in the chat window so far, or you can go ahead and type them into the Teams
we
chat.
We have Gail Dulal of Trinidad and Tobago's MPU raising her hand there. James,
I see that hand raised. Okay, yeah. So go ahead, Gail, if you want to unmute and ask a question.
Gail, I think you're still muted.
Or you could try typing. You are.
Jerry, since you muted her, maybe you would need to unmute her. I'm not sure.
No, she's no, she don't mute herself. I think the mutes are easily rescindable.
Jasmine, tell them I cannot unmute. Just tell them.
I hear you know, Gail. I hear you know, Gail. Yes.
You hearing me?
Yes, Gail.
But I don't understand. My thing is unmute. Hello?
Yes,
we hear you now.
We're hearing you.
Okay, good. Right. So my question is, what I want for our country is that we want least regret, but we want it at least cost. So, and we don't want to make any big mistakes like Tanzania, right? So, So we're looking for that kind of planning that will result in least regrets, but also it will take into consideration least cost, because we want our situation to take into consideration that we are a little lower. For example, in the hurricane, we are a little lower than where the other islands are in terms of where the hurricanes will strike. We are susceptible to flooding, but generally speaking, we have some good, we have a very, very good utility, and they respond well to different weather conditions and all that. So we want all that to be taken into consideration when we are doing our IRRP plan. So talk to me about that.
That's good to hear, Gail. And I think I probably emphasized that the IRRP process does include the least regrets process, but it can also include the least cost process. So instead of just focusing on return on investment or the lowest cost options, we can incorporate those other considerations around socioeconomic impact and hazards and threats that need to be included so that Trinidad and Tobago don't have any regrets with their plan and the system that they create in 10 or 20 years from now. So I think that's part of the process.
Hi, Elisa. One additional thing too. 99% of our population has access to our grid. So that's the other thing. You see, like in Tanzania's case, we see they're looking at like a huge, like 60 million connections. We wouldn't have to look at that kind of scenario. So we could focus some of our risk management actually on the resilience and also on keeping our existing reliability and availability.
Exactly. And that's a perfect example. If you have a system that's working well now, you don't want to compromise that system. So one of your goals might be to keep that reliability. I think that's an excellent example. Thank you, Gail. Are there any other questions?
Doesn't look like it right now.
Okay.
Feel free to type any questions in the chat box as they come up, and we'll be able to pause and get to them later on in the presentation.
Great. Thanks, James. All right, James, do you want to walk us through the? Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Everybody. Yeah, just to mention, I was remiss in not apologizing for Dr. Jackson before. He joined us a little bit late, but he may have to dip out of the meeting again. So I wonder if we could just give him the floor for a little bit so he could just say a few words to the participants.
Absolutely.
Dr. Jackson?
He probably has the same problem with the mute, Gerald.
That is possible. Doc, you hearing us? I was just typing with him a little while ago. Oh dear, maybe he dropped off again. I know he was having a few challenges on his end because he's in Jamaica right now. He's not with us. All right, let's move on then. But yes, apologies from Doc. He won't be able to stay with us for the whole session, but he just wanted to let everybody know that he's glad for the turnout. So yeah, we can continue.
Great, thanks,
All
Jerry.
Right. Yeah, thanks. So to give you all a better sense of this process, we'll walk through some of these steps together, and we'll do that using the imaginary, fictional, made-up country of Tanzania. And we're going to imagine that we are part of their IRRP planning team and go through some of the steps of this process together. Now, in reality, this process would take a lot longer and it would be a lot more thorough and comprehensive. But for now, we'll just focus on a brief overview and truncated steps going through it. So a background on this imaginary country of Tanzania. So they are located in the Caribbean. They have 200,000 residents. their customers pay 42 cents per kilowatt hour for energy. Their energy generation system consists of an aging fuel oil-based power plant. They have above ground distribution lines, and there's no tree trimming or maintenance programs to protect those lines. Some of their risks, like you're familiar with, include hurricanes, drought, the economic instability from relying heavily on this one fuel oil-based industry, and aging infrastructure in their system. They also have NDC goals, including a 50% reduction in fossil fuel consumption by the year 2030. So given that they've laid out that goal by 2030, that might be either the planning horizon they look at in the IRRP process, or at least an interim goal in that process. And then they've got a great solar resource and onshore wind resource, and looks like they've got some great beaches on this island too. All right, so we'll go back to the poll everywhere platform. That link is still in the chat, so you can click on that. And our first question here is going to be, as a member of the IRRP team in Tanzania, what are your top 3 concerns now? So I'll switch the screen over to showing the results. And for this, we've done a word cloud, which treats each word you type in separately. So you can either type them as one word, or you can put a dash between the words if it's really it's one phrase. But in any case, even if you put a space between them, we'll get a good sense of what the priorities are, you think, in Tanzania. So we're definitely showing energy cost as one of the biggest ones showing up here. Definitely some hazards, maybe the electricity mix, reliability, hurricanes in particular. So this is it today, at this point in time. What are your concerns in the present?
Looks like vegetation management is another concern that's showing up.
Probably diversification of your generation mix. That's a good one. All right. So that looked at today what your top 3 concerns are. The next question is going to say, what are your top 3 concerns for 2040? So you send yourself into the future, into the year 2040, and think about what your top 3 concerns will be then. Economic stability coming in. The environment, good, always good to see. Sea rise, looking at different future climate conditions. Everything's even right now. Cost, there we go. So we see overall, we do see a lot of the same terms coming up, but definitely some different things too. Things like sea level rise, something you'd be concerned about in the future, and not as much right now. Definitely a lot more sustainability and reliability showing up bigger on this word cloud. Climate. So as you look into the future, you see you are a lot more concerned with some of these more resilient related goals. Okay.
So decarbonization pop up there too. These are all great things to include.
Yeah, so if you'd only, so these, you see how these concerns are different. If you make sure you think about what your concerns will be in the future, that will really help. That will form different goals than if you just thought about what they are in the present and what the least cost current options are, and that would leave you worse off in the future if you only plan for the present. So keeping all these in mind, both your present concerns and your future concerns, which are both important in setting the goals, we'll go to the next question, which is, as a member of the IRRP team in Tanzania, what top 3 goals would you like to create for the country to reach in 2040? So rather than just your concerns now, what will actually be the goals then for your power system? And this one comes as a list. You can upvote or downvote options too. So we can try to reach some consensus as members of the IRRP Tanzania team what our top goals are by looking at what other people are typing in and upvoting or downvoting them. So 100% RE coming in strong or so far. Universal access, affordable rates, diversification of the generation, power generation, and self-reliance. I'm sure a lot of things that you all relate to in your countries. You see, nobody's downvoted anything yet, so these are all valid options. All right, so let's see. Going to take a screenshot of this to use in one of our coming slides. So I think we're leveling off. Let's see. So let's see, jot down, that's our top 3 are 100% RE, generation diversification, we'll go top 4, or universal access and affordable rates, or affordability. Universal access. Okay, so keeping those in mind then, those are the top goals. We'll look at those top 4 goals of the power system. Our next question is going to ask, for those 4 goals, what are the KPIs that will help support these goals that you've established? So we'll look specifically at the goals of 100% renewable energy, generation diversification, universal access, and affordable rates. So if you remember for our example of Tanzania, some of their KPIs were things like cost, environmental impact, fuel security and reliability, resource adequacy, financial risk exposure. So you're kind of thinking along those lines in developing these KPIs. So your actual percentage of renewable energy, that would be a good KPI and a good metric. For your 100% renewable energy goal. Your cost, your dollar per kilowatt hour KPI. So the KPI would be cost, and in this case, the actual metric would be dollars per kilowatt hour. And so that's definitely a good one for affordable rates. Kilowatt hours per GDP. Social and environmental impacts. Just pure amount of megawatts of RE installed. Let's see, we have any addressing universal access on here? Percent electrification, there we go. about generation diversification. We've got %RE. Is there anything that specifically addresses a diverse pool of generating assets?
There's one that addresses tons of CO2 per gigawatt hour.
Is that down tons of CO2 per gigawatt hour? Nice. All right, so for all, so yeah, these are really good. Shows you're all paying attention, right? So this process would probably be done first in identifying all of these different KPIs or metrics that go with them, and then weighting them or giving them some kind of ranking. So what we're doing here by upvoting them or giving a thumbs up or thumbs down to different KPIs and then their specific metrics, that's simulating this weighting process that would happen. Now, this is one way you could do it. You could just see how many positive votes each gets. You could weight it on a kind of high, medium, or low priority or scale. You could give it a quantitative 1, 2, or 3 score in this process. But by doing that, you are setting the stage for what you're, aligning these KPIs with your goals and laying out, before you run the scenarios, before you put this into models, you're laying out, what your priorities are and how heavily those will weigh into the process. So in this case, we could give %RE a score of 10, and that could be our weighting factor for this, or cost of energy, we could give a score of 8 and 6 and so on. And that's one method by which we could do this. Okay, I think I'll flip back over to the slides now. I'll pause this one, stop that. And once there we go. So an outline of all these questions are in the slides. We went through them in the Poll Everywhere software, but I do have slides on all these for when we share the slides afterwards. You'll be able to go through those. I did have it broken out separately for KPIs and different metrics that'll help measure those KPIs. We kind of did those together in one as the metrics kind of came in with the KPIs, and then we weighted them by upvoting or downvoting. So then after this, so we came up with some goals, but for this, let's just say Tanzania went through their process and came up with the energy goals, 3 energy goals listed here, reducing energy costs, having a system that's more resilient to hurricanes and fuel supply disruptions, and then meeting the NDC goal of 50% fossil fuel reductions. So what solutions then might help Tanzania meet their goals? If you're still in the Poll Everywhere software, we could, I'll head back over to that and we can type in some solutions that actually might help them meet their goals. So far, we've got solar PV systems. Yep. Here we go. Wind farms, IRRP process, using their solar resources, RE installation. Some onshore wind. Yep. Cool. So these are great options that might help them meet their goals here. These are all great. And so these would help form the different scenarios and the makeup of the scenarios as you go through this IRRP process. Now, One thing that we have to also look at, and I think we're running a little short on time, so we'll have to go through these a little faster here. But when you create these scenarios, you form your goals based on what you want in the future, and you form these different solutions and scenarios. But then you look at different potential futures, as Eliza mentioned. What could happen in the future that would change what we just came up with on the last slide? You could have an increased frequency of hurricanes. You could have policies in place for higher renewable energy percentages, higher imported diesel prices. Your population could boom. There could be a submarine high voltage cable from a nearby island that's proposed. A carbon tax. A volcanic eruption that puts ash from a nearby island that puts ash into the sky, something like that. A major plant failure, decreased natural gas production. These are all things that can help form other scenarios. You come up with a long list of those potential futures, and then you have to filter them down and thinking what is practical and realistic. How many scenarios should be contemplated? Tanzania whittled their list down to 7 scenarios. Weighting those different scenarios, what's most important and what should be considered. And then after coming up with those, thinking if there's any more KPIs that you need to consider in the process. So to review that, sorry.
James, can I ask a really quick question?
Yes.
I think in the chat box there was a comment that it would be helpful to share the results from the polls. So I just wanted to acknowledge that we received that, and if we are able to do that, we'll include those in the slides.
Yes, we definitely can. I can at least, they're saved, so I can at least share screenshots of them. I'll see if I can export a report that we could share also when we send those slides.
Great, thank you.
Great. So just as an overview wrap up then, for the IRRP scenario development process, you want to look at your baseline conditions and then establish goals, considering both the present and future, present state, and then the future, whatever future goals you might have, and use those to kind of guide your scenario development, which definitely should consider changing conditions and different potential futures, especially climate change and different climate conditions that might happen in the future. Filter down those scenarios kind of based on what you think is feasible and what is most important to your power sector in the future, and then developing KPIs. And that could happen when you're forming goals in the process, like we did here, which I think is good because that makes sure that those KPIs are aligned with your goals. But you could also revisit and see if you need to embed more KPIs later on in the process. All right, so now we'll we're going to do the breakout room part of the workshop now. And so we're going to do breakout rooms by country. And for those breakout rooms, we're going to use the worksheet that was sent around to you before this workshop. I think it was included in the invitation. The first part of that worksheet is going to be the questionnaire that we sent around after the last meeting that we had. But we'll actually start on page 4 of the worksheet where it says scenario exercise 2. So as I'm doing this, if you can try to dig up that worksheet and open it up and get on page 4. We're going to go through scenario exercises 2 and 3 now. And for each country group, someone in your group should open this worksheet and share a screen when we go to these breakout rooms. And I'll tell you how to do that in a second. But when we go to these breakout rooms, someone should decide to be the note taker and share the screen and take notes for each country group. And the questions that I have on the screen in the PowerPoint here, those are exactly the same questions as are on the worksheet. So you don't need to write these down or worry that they're going away in a second. And when you do go join the other meeting, you don't have to leave this meeting. You can just join that other meeting. That'll put this meeting on hold. And then when we're done with the breakout sessions, we'll come back into this meeting. We can share have some informal reporting. We can share any interesting insights or questions that you have from the process. And then we'll do a little wrap up and come back. So what sounds good? Should we do 15 minutes? Should we go out into these rooms and come back at 25 past? I think sounds good.
Yeah, I think 15 minutes should be good.
Okay, so 15 minutes should be good. When you go into these breakout rooms, we'll have either Eliza or me or a SICRI member in your room too to help guide the discussion and deal with any questions that come up. I think maybe Jerry posted links to the different breakout rooms in the chat for this meeting. So that's probably the easiest way to get there. Make sure you click on, your country's breakout room. Or if you, that's probably the easiest way. It might be in your calendar or in your email also, but clicking on the link in the chat's the easiest way to get there.
Correct. I would have posted it at 2:18 p.m. my time. So if anyone doesn't see, just scroll right up. You should see the links there for all the countries, but it is also in your emails and possibly in your calendars as well. There is a secret person assigned to each group just to help facilitate a little bit, but this will be driven by the countries and you, the stakeholders. We're here to listen to you and looking forward to working. So I'm going to dip across to the Guyana group now, and my colleagues will do the same. So their respective groups, that is.
Thanks, Jerry.
Yeah, thanks.
So it sounds like the St. Lucia group is back in the main room. Is that correct?
Hi, Eliza. Yeah, I'm actually just checking through the participants list to make sure nobody had issues rejoining. I see some of them have,
Okay.
some might still be on hold.
Okay, thank you. It's always a little risky leaving this room and going to a different room. So hopefully it will work out for everybody.
I thought it was automatic, but you actually have to press resume as well. So I hope nobody's missed that.
And Jean-Michel, how many questions were you able to get through in your group?
To be honest, we focus on the first section mostly, which is how we imagine the just putting back to it, future conditions. And then we just touched on IRRP goals, but we didn't discuss it much. Most of the focus of the discussion was just on the first.
Okay, great. Thank you.
No problem. Looks like we may have been preemptive in coming back.
John, are you hearing me? James, rather, are you hearing me? James, we're not hearing you.
We're hearing you. You're back in the main room now.
We're back from the Guyana breakout group. Sorry it took a little longer than expected.
And I'm back.
Great, thank you. So it sounds like, Jerry, we have Guyana back, we have Trinidad and Tobago, because I think that was Gail, and then we have St. Lucia. Do we have Belize and Jamaica as well?
I saw a few persons from Jamaica messaging saying that they had to step off. So
Okay.
I don't know if how many of the Jamaicans will be rejoining us, but as for Belize, I think I just got a message from Penny, so she might be coming in. Let me message her again.
Okay.
I think St. Lucia said they're back in the chat.
All right, let me message Penny and ask him to bring him back.
So Elisa, maybe in Trinidad we could discuss with the utility and the all our stakeholders to complete that that worksheet.
Yeah, and so Gail, we didn't think everybody would get through every question on the worksheet because that is a lot of information, but we wanted to use it just as a resource for all of you to use when you are thinking through different scenarios with the power sector stakeholders that you're going to engage in the IRRP process.
Okay.
And it's really, I think, the way that it's laid out in the worksheet is starting with those baseline conditions. That information is probably familiar to those of you who have looked at the questionnaire that was sent out in advance. And so it's really intended to kind of guide you through the different considerations that would go into these different types of scenarios. So this was just a start. I know that it sounds like St. Lucia got through scenario exercise number 2, looking at future conditions, and then talked a little bit about the third exercise, which is going through the IRRP goals. But I think that's really designed more as a resource to help you with different types of considerations that you want to include in those scenarios. Does that help, Gail?
Yes, it does, Elisa.
Okay, great. And then I'm just curious, does anyone from St. Lucia want to share what the results of the conversation were, just briefly with scenario exercise number 2, what the grid looks like in 2050 and what the energy mix is?
So, Eliza, I actually supported the team with some, casting up the worksheet and taking some notes for them.
Okay.
So I can put it up unless I have any volunteers jumping in from St. Lucia who want to speak to it. Once I put it up, I can do that. Would I be able to share quickly? Just take off the slide. Anybody from St. Lucia want to just quickly go through it? Give a pause in case anybody wants to come in. Denise, good.
You're doing a great job so far, so if you can continue.
I'm facilitating y'all, Belize. No problem. I will speak to the information collected. So quickly, the St. Lucian contingent thought the grid in 2050 is a smarter grid, employing more smart technologies. It's more autonomous due to that fact. There are more efficient grid operations and greater efficiency in general. They envision more distributed resources across the network, and that is actually facilitating more peer-to-peer type interactions on a grid. Of course, it's a smarter grid able to facilitate those types of interactions. It's more resilient to the impact of storms particularly, but I mean more resilient in general as well. Things like mini grids are evident in the power system where they might not be now. In general, a lot of the other facilitating policy and regulation is there to ensure that all these things can actually come to bear. In general, I know this was listed as fuel prices, but the group was more concerned with the fact that just in general, the energy price is more affordable for the average consumer. And Of course, there'll be changing trends and dynamics. So even while there'll be greater efficiency on the grid, the hope is that with a bunch of sectors coming on and becoming electrified, the grid will be able to handle that increase in electrification and that new trend that appears in the future. So that was it for the solution group. That's the future solution grid in a nutshell.
Great, thank you. Did other breakout groups have a similar goal of having that type of energy mix and envisioning what the grid will look like in 2050?
Well, maybe Trinidad was not, well, we didn't get as far as committing stuff to paper. And I suspect that we weren't as ambitious. I think what Trinidad suffers put up what we managed to commit to paper. What Trinidad suffers from is a fair amount of inertia. We have an extremely well-developed transmission system, which services some fairly large customers, large relative to the maximum demand. So we're gonna be keeping. We'll have no choice but to keep much of the existing structure, and sort of hope to augment it with injections of renewable resources. To get to some of those resources, we might have to do a transmission extension, unless they're really very, very small capacity resources going in the distribution system. We were aiming for, we imagined 40% renewables, mostly PV and wind, with the rest being fossil, almost exclusively gas, as is the case now. We saw Tobago possibly becoming electrically disconnected from the system, because as the load in Tobago has grown and the capacity in Tobago has increased, the case for keeping the legacy inter-island connection, I think, sort of dwindles. Because the grid is not as well developed in Tobago, there's more opportunity for microgrids and that sort of thing. I suspect that's sort of what would have gone on the page if we had a bit more time.
Great, thank you for sharing that with us.
Yeah. Eliza, if I may, can I?
Yes, absolutely, Gail.
So what the customers that John was speaking about is that we remember Trinidad, unlike the rest of the Caribbean, we have a downstream petrochemical customer who uses more than half of all our electricity demand. So reliability and availability is very, very critical to them, and that is one of the reasons for our you see that 60% fossil, but we're open for, that's just a tentative thing that we discussed recently, so it's not something that is solidly fixed in concrete. So we are open to like this intelligent discussions about how we can handle our customers who demand availability and reliability at all times.
Yeah, that's a really good consideration. And it's interesting to see that 40% renewable energy by 2050 vision, because that is above the current goal of 10% renewable energy, isn't it?
Yeah, that's way above that, yeah.
Yeah, so different considerations, and I think you're on the right track with thinking through that reliable power is needed and is necessary, and you're not willing to sacrifice that just yet for some of these other considerations. So that helps. That's one of the drivers that's going to help shape some of the goals and the vision that you have for the IRRP process.
Yeah, and in the same breath, Eliza, in the same breath, we don't want to sound like if we are not ambitious, because remember, John pointed out, we will possibly, remember, we consist of 2 islands, Trinidad and Tobago, and what we're looking at in the future is that having Tobago, which doesn't have the industry that Trinidad has, having Tobago go all out 100% RE, We actually ambitious in that aspect. In fact, I find our whole thing is ambitious because we must take into consideration what is going to happen to our petrochemical industry, and and all the implications of that.
Absolutely. And if that's an economic stabilizer for Trinidad and Tobago, it's really important to consider that as well. I know that some island nations and territories have gone through the IRRP process and haven't necessarily considered the industries that rely on power. And so they've created systems that don't have reliable power. And so those industries have then created their own microgrids, which causes some other challenges with those being customers to a grid provider. So these are all really important considerations.
We dare not do that. We've been trained over years of the petrochemical industry being in fact the base of our economy to know that one of our primary missions is 99.999% uptime, no questions asked. But what I see possibly is that for most levels below that, you could have microgrids connected to transmission system, and as I said, you'd have maybe large renewable energy projects connected to the existing transmission grid, and transmission grid being used because the island is sufficiently large enough. It's sufficiently large that very short-term intermittency does not happen all over the island all at once.
Yes.
So the grid can be used to smooth one area against the other, and reduce the percentage short-term variation in sort of minute to minute or hour to hour. And then with the help of some storage and demand side management, maybe we could get to those sort of levels of penetration.
Absolutely, John. Absolutely.
And I think, I'm not sure if Dr. Jackson has spoken to you about continuing Trinidad and Tobago discussion on this topic, but I think because you do have such reliable power, you're in a unique situation. And so we're happy to answer any additional questions about how to go through this IRRP process with you all to understand that a little bit better. I wanted to check to see if Belize wanted to just report out really quickly or offer any of the other member states a minute or two to tell us what they discussed.
Hi, yeah, good afternoon. Herschel here from Belize. I've been nominated to speak on our behalf, but I'll have to ask Sheena or Ryan to share the document that we were working in.
Great. It looks like it's up on the screen. Thanks, Sheena.
Right. Thanks. So we didn't get too specific with our responses, but we're a bit broader. The time was short, so we tried to just hurry and rush through after a little while. But looking at what the grid would look like in 2050, just for some background, our grid currently is made up of a large transmission network with 115 kV as well as 69 kV lines. And then we have distribution networks across the country. Belize we have a lot more land area than the average Caribbean island, I think. And so our grid is pretty expansive. Our thought is that the grid probably will not be going anywhere anytime soon, but that at least as it relates to the way that energy is distributed on it, that the distribution side will become much more busier with energy traffic. We're thinking. We also have an interconnection to Mexico, and we don't think that is going anywhere, because we also feel that in the future we will be having an even further interconnection either through Mexico or through Guatemala with the CPAC network, which is the Central American network. There are some standards for connecting to that, and we have been aiming towards achieving that. So by 2050, we believe that will be in place. We foresee a lot of energy that transfer and sharing across that network, both between countries and then within Belize. We're seeing an energy highway on that distribution network, transmission and distribution network, that will allow for much more players than we currently have. And that will be characterized by a lot more distributed energy sources on the distribution network, of course. So we've looked at solar rooftop, solar microgrids. Hydro is a big source for us. We have large rivers, and hydro is currently a huge resource. Biomass, because we have some sugarcane industries that the sugarcane industry is still going, and they provide power to us. That's not going anywhere. Wind is not a resource that we currently see as a very viable option as yet, but we're doing some studies there. But I don't see it coming on as heavily as solar. And then, of course, Mexico is our unknown variable. Currently, they supply about 40% of our needs. We were commenting that we are not sure if their energy mix involves more renewables in the future, or if they continue with fossil fuels. I'm thinking that they also, like the rest of the world, moves towards more renewable energy sources as well. So we have a goal right now of 85%. Ryan was saying he's seeing that closer to 80, but with Mexico as the unknown variable, in 2050 we could be as closer to 90 or 95, depending on what Mexico does.
Okay, great. And I noticed that you included some climate considerations, not predictable seasons and patterns, potentially an increase in storms resulting in impacts. Did you include any discussion on like the political impacts or stability or energy security related to a connection with Mexico or Guatemala?
We didn't really reach that level of discussion, no. But that's an excellent point, and that's something that would definitely be a factor, especially if we're interconnecting with Guatemala, who has a claim over us right now.
Yeah, well, yeah, and these are all things that can be built into different scenarios. So these are great. It's excellent that the conversation has been started, and hopefully this worksheet will just help with some of those discussions at least, so that when you do start the IRRP process, you can use that as a guide to the different considerations that you might want to talk about as a group.
Yeah.
Great.
Thanks.
Thank you.
The time was just short, but I think we got a good start. Yeah.
Yeah, you did get a good start. That's excellent. And yeah, we apologize for not having more time to talk through a lot of these different questions and scenarios. But as I mentioned, we'll follow up with Dr. Jackson and maybe Gerald Lindo to talk through some of the potential next steps. And if you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to James and me, and we're happy to answer any of the questions that anyone might have. But I know we're over time, so I just wanted to summarize the process that we've talked about today. So we've talked through the importance for understanding the baseline conditions and risks, and hopefully that came through in the different examples and the different breakout sessions, that it's important to understand where you are now so that you can set goals that are going to be more resilient. So when you set goals, it's important to develop those key performance indicators and make sure that they are measurable. And then if you apply different scenarios and select scenarios, as James illustrated with the Tanzania example, you could have 25 different scenarios and then down select to 7 scenarios. That's just going to help you with different types of considerations. But then it's really important, once you do have that IRRP in place, it's important that you monitor and evaluate how those different projects and solutions are helping you to achieve your goals so that you can adjust them if you need to and implement different solutions or projects as they're warranted. Again, we say this is an iterative process because conditions are constantly changing. You might have a new funding stream that helps you implement a project, and so it is iterative. So I'm gonna stop there, and I really appreciate all of you participating in this workshop, not just listening, but listening and being active participants in the polling that James led and in the breakout sessions. And I think on the next slide, James, we might have, we have our email addresses on these slides. And as we mentioned, these will be sent out to you afterwards. Hopefully we can include the poll results because it sounds like there's some interest in those. And if you do have any questions, please feel free to reach out to me or to James. And if you need, I'm sure Dr. Jackson or Jerry can help facilitate the discussion as well. Any last minute questions from anyone? Oh, go ahead, James.
In these slides we share, there's a couple slides of resources as well, some that will be used in future workshops on the modeling side of it, and then also some links to some of the resources we discussed in this presentation. So you'll have access to those when we send it out. And otherwise, yep, thank you all for being attentive and engaged and involved.
All right. Thank you all so much.
Okay, and thank you. Looking forward to the next one.
Thank
so good.
All right, thank you all. Have a good rest of your day.
Take care,
Thanks,
guys.
guys.
Bye.
Thanks so much. Same to you. Bye-bye.
Same to you.
All right, bye. I'll take care.
Take care, everyone.
Take care, bye.